I'm Mike Flannery. I'm Associate Director for Historical Collections here at UAB. And welcome to another of our Reynolds Historical Lecture Series. Stephen Casper comes to us from Clarkson University, where he currently holds an appointment in the history of science. He is just recently been promoted to assistant professor there as a matter of, 2 days ago, I think. So that's congratulations to Dr. Casper. He received his PhD in the history of medicine from University College London. He has held several fellowships and has served as a lecturer at the Wellcome Trust Center for the History of Medicine. While Dr. Casper's dissertation and research interests have centered on the history of neurology, his other area of expertise has been in the area of global medical history, a subject he has taught and written about extensively. It is worth noting that just last year he presented on this topic at the American Association for the History of Medicine when it held its meeting at Cleveland Clinic. So today we have a perfect scholar to give a framework for our exhibit, Against the Odds, Making a Difference in Global Health. And I certainly want to invite every one of you to the reception in the museum to follow, a reception co-sponsored, thankfully, by our UAB School of Public Health. But first, please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Casper as he presents on Globalizing Medical Histories. Thank you.
Thank you for that warm welcome, and thank you for inviting me. It's a great honor and privilege to speak to you today on a topic that is a growing interest, I think, in the history of medicine. Now, I know that in the sciences and in the medical profession, it's typical, commonplace even, to have more than one author on a paper these days. But in history, this is actually a kind of strange phenomenon. But I would be remiss if I did not instantly give credit to Professor Harold Cook, who has been working with me on this project now for several years. And in fact, what you're about to hear today is so much both of our work. I couldn't tell you where his work begins and mine ends, and vice versa. So I am not taking any credit at all for what you hear, but I would like to alert you to his contribution specifically, and also point out that, in fact, this is what going global means. We're going to be all collaborating an awful lot more than we thought we were going to be. When I told my friends that I was giving a lecture on global history and medicine, they were shocked. They said, well, what would that not include? And I still haven't come up with an answer to that question. It's big, it's gigantic, and it's here. And I think rather than reading you the paper that I have, that's what historians do. We read papers, we don't talk to bullet points. I think I'll talk and have a thinking out loud session with you today. I think we'll all prefer that. And in fact, I hope what I'll be able to do is extend a little bit in different directions to try to tell you how many different historians of medicine are beginning to think about the issue of approaching medicine from a global perspective. And there are a lot of issues. But let's start at the beginning. It makes sense that we're thinking globally, yes. It's a new 21st century world in which everything seems to be connected together. We live in a digital age in which social networking sites, email, various modes of communication, banking, seem to make the world so much smaller that it almost seems archaic that Jules Verne could have imagined that a person could go around the world in 80 days. Why do it in 80 days when you can do it in 80 milliseconds, I say. But it's worth remembering what we are comparing the global perspective against, because we are all coming from a background that, in fact, is not a global background. Not even 15 years ago, perhaps, maybe a little bit earlier for some, a little bit later for others, we thought about the world comprised of discrete units. We thought about nations, we thought about locals, we thought about structures, we thought about institutions. We thought about things not moving but standing still. We thought about static entities. And then somewhere, and probably it was the internet that prompted this kind of thinking, we began to think about connections. We began to think about motions. We began to think about movements. And we began to ask questions like, is it possible to have a history of moving objects? Because history is a profoundly static discipline. It's a discipline that focuses on structures. It focuses on concepts. And when you put those things in motion, challenges begin to arise. And they arise simply in the literary form. It's very hard to write about movement. You can do it with a painting, but history isn't about pictures and 1,000 words. So, digital metaphors probably shape our thinking. They probably lead us into the languages of connection. And it's probably those metaphors that have set up a lot of the languages for the global paradigm. But we probably need to go back to the idea of discrete units and look very briefly at the sociology of science and the history of science in the 80s and 90s to begin to see that in those 2 decades, historians of science and historians of medicine became very concerned with what they termed the local construction of scientific knowledge, the local ways in which science and medical knowledge were made and produced. And among those historians and sociologists include Stephen Casper and a program that came to be called the Strong Program of the Sociology of Science. Now, without going too deeply into this, what basically this critique was in the history of science was the argument that scientific knowledge was made in locals, and in consequence, often the conclusions of scientific research incorporated in very peculiar local values, prejudices, and assumptions. So even though the content of science was universal, and medicine was universal, the presentation, the arguments that were made about that science, and indeed when there were scientific controversies, the way in which those controversies were resolved bore more to do with the social circumstances of knowledge production than they actually did with the actual content of knowledge. Now this was, and still remains, a controversial program. But if it was true, if in fact local circumstances changed the way in which scientific knowledge or medical knowledge was made, then a question that immediately arose, and this quote here from Chapin is articulating it. Why did these concepts travel, and what happened when we traveled? The question, of course, was about how does knowledge become universal when it's local? We can well imagine this, I think, if we think about our own history with globalization. Globalization, the integration of economies, the convergence of values, political culture, spoke to a wide set of social, cultural, and economic forces that were occurring in everyone's lives that made local production much more significant. And all of this homogenization that was taking place meant that there were negotiations also taking place at larger global levels. So the question that the sociologists of science were asking was germane to real events that were taking place in their life. Now, globalization as a phenomenon that has been with us should be distinguished from what I'm actually going to be talking about today, which is the global perspective. And it's important to see that globalization as a phenomenon is a part of the global story. But the global perspective in terms of writing a history of medicine, or writing a history for that matter, entails something slightly different. The global perspective, in contrast with studies of globalization, emphasizes instead the notion that as historians, or for that matter sociologists, anthropologists, and any other group of people who are interested in global studies, but as a group, we need to attempt to apply reciprocal treatment over the types of sources that we use. We need to look at primary sources in a variety of places, situate them in appropriate social, political, and cultural context, and then try to synthesize from those sources a broader argument about asymmetries of power, about exchange, about diffusion and translation. We put this in a little bit of concrete terms. The global perspective means that we can't just simply look at the world from the perspective of Washington, D.C. We need to look at the world from the perspective of all of the different places that are entailed. And not surprisingly, everyone's going to have different views. So today, my talk is going to talk about this global approach, in contrast to globalization, and I'm going to then move on to try to indicate a little bit about how the history of medicine will change, and I'll do that through a specific focus on the ways in which scientific concepts emerge in this story, and specifically about the challenges to understanding how scientific and medical concepts move between these different places. I'll give you a hint here. It turns out that different places have different understandings of their concepts, and probably when you put it together, you have what's universal in them. So, how are we going to do this? What's it going to entail? What is going to be involved in a global history of medicine? Well, we probably should begin by admitting that the ways in which history have tended to be written from local, regional, national, or supranational perspectives. But we need to go a little bit more into this, okay? So typically, we have a historian, I'm picking on the United States, looking outward, but this would apply with equal force anywhere on the planet, and not just in the northern and western hemispheres, but also in the eastern and southern hemispheres. That's an important point to make. But we have a historian in, say, Washington, D.C., looking at an event that had happened in, say, Central Europe, okay? And the way in which this event would be understood would be from the perspective specifically of Washington, D.C. It might, therefore, the story that the historian might tell might be told through a local picture, might be told with regional interests in mind, it might be told with national interests, it might even have a supranational story in mind. But the important detail here is that the perspectives and national tradition of history telling entailed in this historian's perspective would be the thing applied to understanding what was happening in Central Europe. Now, there are lots of complaints about the limits of history, and without giving all of them away, I think I can point out just some that we might automatically assume would happen. Often, this particular unilateral appreciation of historical events is described as suddenly imperialistic. It's seen as deeply ideological, but actually those are rather nice charges in comparison to the one that none of us want, which is just simple parochialism, right? And these charges probably are fair, in fact. We can look at the arrow, and I've chosen the United States here specifically, because when we start to talk about something like globalization, this big phenomenon that I have made a distinction with, we probably should also admit that many of the complaints about the language of globalization come from other places that have not experienced globalization, or at least claim to have experienced something that they call Americanization. And Americanization, of course, is seen as something bad. It's seen as something that is being some sort of imperialistic project, and it's not described in particularly glowing terms. Many people see globalization studies and even the global perspective as just a new way of Americans engaging in American hegemony across the globe. Now, I'm going to argue, in fact, that this is not what we are doing, but it's probably worth admitting that in the period after the Cold War, it is obvious that this is a neoliberal perspective. And I think we'll just leave it there, and I will certainly take questions on that point afterwards. So we have this approach, and the new approach, by contrast, is something much more bi-directional. It's attempting to look at the event that happens in Central Europe and the event as it's perceived in Washington, D.C., and attempting to understand how each local understanding understands that event, each regional interpretation, each national interpretation, with the hope of coming up with a new supranational perspective. I will apply this back to medicine, I promise. It's coming, so bear with me. Now, the emphasis of this global perspective then is understanding the conditions as they were in both places, understanding the different opportunities, different experiences of all of the players in position, and the goal is to try to understand why actors in both places or institutions in both places behaved the way they behaved, and to take away from this a larger lesson about the relationship between the various places that are implicated. Basically, this approach brings with it a series of pragmatic challenges, and these should be obvious right away. The first are the real banal ones. This is going to involve, for the historian, a great deal of traveling, a lot of expense, and an enormous amount of time. Whereas we used to be comfortable knowing what our perspective was, now we have to try to understand what other people's perspectives were. We have to sum them together, and of course the limits of having a career and all of these other fun things that we call private life mean that it's going to take longer to actually write these stories. But I think that we'll probably agree that the stories are going to be slightly better. But these issues only alert us to the challenges that historians right now would be facing. They don't tell us much more about the broader and deeper issues that we're going to have to confront. And probably in the 21st century, historians in training are going to be contending with these issues much more. The issue of languages is going to almost certainly necessitate broader collaborations between historians. And now you're not simply accountable for an enormous secondary literature from your own national school of history writing, but you're also accountable for a large set of secondary literatures from all of the other traditions that you happen to want to look at. And each of those traditions has its own forms of parochialism. For example, a historian wanting to write on Southeast Asia from a global perspective is going to have to deal with a rich and vibrant post-colonial history in, say, India, and take that into account when they're writing their own stories, because otherwise this charge of parochialism is going to be very quickly levied against them. So the work dramatically increases. Now, historians of medicine have typically focused on diseases, institutions, and the professions, have been the mainstays of the history of medicine, and that probably isn't going to change, but it needs to be caveated, because we should probably admit that while disease might be taken to be universal, institutions and the profession, as they've been understood, have tended to be Western medicine and Western science, and even in the last 800 years, they haven't been constant entities in even the West. And then when you throw into the picture the two obvious examples of Eastern medicine and Chinese medicine, you begin to ask questions about the profession as it was constructed in the East as opposed to in the West. You can see that the story is, at the least, complex. This interest in trying to balance out these areas of the Western historical tradition's interest in the history of medicine with the East probably will lead to, again, these charges of relativism, imperialism, or worse, even essentialism. And we'll have to, I'm not going to throw out lots of isms, by the way, but we'll have to keep this in mind, because the charge actually can be quite significant. It turns out that in locals, the local understanding of disease and health often brings with it certain social constructions. In the West, we have certain understandings, specific understandings of disease and our medical practices, and in other places they have their own. And the moment one begins to insist that one is better than the other, these charges begin to be floated out in the air. Now, what Professor Cook and I have been arguing, and as a way of resolving all of these challenges and talking about how we're going to make sense of them and recover in all of this relativism a universal narrative of science, has been the notion that instead of thinking of medicine and science as just given entities, as things that exist idealistically and perfectly. What we need to do instead is think of science and medicine as something that is made through interactions. Okay, so science and scientific knowledge and medical knowledge are created when peoples in a variety of different places met, sometimes violently, sometimes not violently, exchanged information. And the important part about our thesis is that what we assume is that the parties often did not understand each other. That in fact they appropriated customs, they practiced traditions, and cast them in totally different knowledge systems, and totally different traditions, and totally different cosmologies, but nevertheless used them. And through this, made medicine and science in the West, in the East, and in between. And I will, as I said, be providing some more concrete examples of this in a while. So what would a global history of medicine look like? Well, we can take it as a given that societies and cultures and the practices of those societies and cultures are interconnected. And moreover, we can probably admit that most societies and most cultures had their own distinctive traditions and their own distinctive cosmologies. And the window through which a historian of medicine would view those specifically would be in how these societies have attempted to prevent illnesses, how they have treated the sick. It was George Rosen who long ago noted that one of the things that seems to knit all peoples across the planet together was their desire to avoid death and to try to alleviate death and illness through treatment. So this tells us that we are dealing with some sort of tangible universal. But the ways in which all these different societies have engaged with the challenge of illness and the challenge of death, of course, can be completely different. And this perhaps also provides us then with an understanding of why the history of medicine actually is a very powerful way of understanding the history of civilizations. The ways in which people engage in their survival, the ways in which they engage in attempting to treat the sick and the elderly and all these other natural results of living tell us a great deal about how these cultures and how these societies and small groups see the world, provided we look. Because often we see when we look at these societies what we want to see, not actually what they're doing. And that's an incredibly important aside. For example, early modern Europeans, as some of you may know, in the 17th century discovered the circulation of the blood. And some of these early modern Europeans were not just simply interested in the circulation of the blood, they were also interested in looking outside of Europe. This was, after all, the great age of exploration. And some of them noted that the Chinese spoke of the circulation of the qi, life force. Their assumption was, and it continued to be a mainstay in the Western medical tradition for several centuries, that there was a similarity between the qi and the blood. Their assumption was that this had been a parallel discovery, or at least a discovery that had been shared between the East and the West. In fact, we know this is not at all true, at all. In fact, qi and blood could not be further apart, although if one looks at the way in which blood was socially constructed in 17th century Europe and compares that with our own understanding today in the 21st century of what blood does, we can see that probably there was actually greater similarity between what 17th century Europeans were thinking about and what the Chinese were thinking about. But still, this is an example of seeing what we want to see, not actually seeing what was the case. When we do a global approach, we have to ask, how is it understood locally, and try to avoid this essentialist opportunity. Now, lots of things are like this. Diseases, species, commodities, concepts, people, practices, they're all transported very easily across borders. Just because they're transported across borders does not mean that people use them, understand them, conceive them, conceptualize them in the same way in all of these various places. We call this tinkering in life, and people tend to tinker with concepts wherever they are. That's, in fact, on some level what progress is. To exchange something is not the same as interpreting it. To interact with something doesn't mean that you're actually passively interacting with it. In fact, the history of civilization seems to be one of violent interaction, not passive interactions. And even the local understandings versus global understandings can be profoundly significant. I can give just one small example. Syphilis might be taken to be a global phenomenon. There are historians who have argued that syphilis originated in North America. That is a debatable point, but what we do know is that for a time in Europe it was called the Italian disease, it was then subsequently called the Spanish disease, and then subsequently called the French disease. Those different languages of naming refer to different prejudices and battles that took place within the European context. And so what we can see here is that disease is locally constructed and yet transmitted globally. And that, of course, is the significant part of the story. Take another more concrete example. This, a favorite of mine from the Wellcome Library by John Bulwer, who was a curosopher. I will allow you to contemplate what that means. I have not yet discovered. But it's from 1653. The very long and richly named title of his book is, let me read it aloud, Anthrometamorphosis, Man Transformed or the Artificial Changeling, historically presented in the mad and cruel gallantry, foolish bravery, ridiculous beauty, filthy fineness, and loathsome loveliness of the most nations, fashioning and altering their bodies from the mold intended by nature, with a vindication of the regular beauty and honesty of nature, and an appendix, of course, of the pedigree of the English gallant. So here we have a block of images of faces in the West, presumably, that have been influenced by non-Western traditions. Black patches on faces showing the influence of India, and extended earlobes showing the influence of South America. We have, in other words, a microcosmic window into the age of exploration, right? The Portuguese have gone to the East Indies and Brazil. The Spanish have gone to the West Indies and North America. And somehow or other, these novel discoveries that they have discovered have so penetrated into Europe by 1653 that John Bulwer has to contemplate what is at stake, which is, of course, the gallant Englishman. It's a global story shaped by local prejudice. These exchanges occur everywhere. A global historian is going to have to contemplate a massive swath of history. I put this collage together to try to capture it. We have, of course, the movements of species, the mosquito, the rat, louse. We have theories of plague. We have letters, telegrams, diaries, explorers, stagecoaches, ships. We have movement everywhere we look, whether we are in 14th century trade routes coming out of China, or whether we're looking at gigantic global health structures that emerged in the 20th century. What we see here is a visually compelling, and I know in the back you can't see this, a visually compelling diagram of the structure of the World Health Organization. These exchanges happening everywhere mean that there are lots of topics that we can examine as historians of medicine, and we have to, Professor Cook and I would argue, try to see how science was made through all of these exchanges. We have to try to not simply look at the rat as something that brought the plague to Europe. We have to also try to understand why the rat came to Europe on those European ships, and we have to understand what the rat might have meant also in the East, just as one example. Well, that's a plea for a program, but it's complicated because it's easy to talk about the movement of sugar. It's easy to talk about how spectacles were shipped across the globe. It's easy for us to give nice accounts of trade in the 17th and 18th century. But concepts are not material culture. They are not objects. They are not things that are instantly quantifiable. They are themselves changing objects. We all know this. Scientific knowledge changes rapidly. And the limits, of course, of our own imagination and our own cultural experience can often get in the way when we begin to interpret concepts. And I'll give an example from Jeffrey Gunn's actually rather good book, First Globalization, the Eurasian Exchange, 1500 to 1800. And I will read this aloud to you just to give you a little bit of an inside view. Gunn writes, while we are conscious of the globalizing forces unleashed by the presence of seaborne trade and commerce of unprecedented proportions, the stuff of economic historians, we are here concerned with the ideological and cultural contestation that accompanied trader missionaries and conquistadors. The other side of the coin of economic imperialism was the scientific and humanistic revolution that incubated in medieval European courts, churches, and centers of learning. At the end of the day, we seek to demonstrate the divergence between the West and the rest was as much intellectual as it was material. Eventually, European science and technology triumphed. Here we have a mantra we instantly like. It's a story we know. It's a story that, if we examine the history of this, we find out generations of Western Europeans and North Americans were inculcated into. It is the Western tradition. It is the great ideas sequence. It is the notion that somehow or other Europeans were different. That Europeans were special and that non-Europeans were not. And therefore, this perspective allowed historians, especially, who were among its greatest advocates, to look at civilizations like China and Islam and say that they lacked something, or to say that they were run by Asian despots. We know these tropes. And what was it they lacked? Well, of course, it was curiosity, openness, energy, individualism, the stuff of the Protestant work ethic, right? Curious this, though, because when you start to look at these civilizations from the perspective of health, one has to ask the obvious question. Can we really believe that people in China or the Orient were not seeking to avoid death and suffering? This cannot be true. Wherever people found better ways of healing themselves, I believe, and probably you do too, that they pursued them with gusto. And since they probably did that, we can see here the limit of this perspective about our specialness. It comes specifically from European values. The global perspective builds in, however, the need to break with this inculcated tradition. Now, this isn't to say that there aren't fundamental differences between peoples. This isn't even to say that there aren't better types of ideas. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just simply saying that it's probably a good idea to ask the question about whether we're engaging in ridicule. And the best way to avoid doing this is to admit right off the bat that this type of historical interpretation is going to be challenging. And to give you a demonstration of this, and an example of the issue of colloquialism, I will just alert you to this one example. Here we have a Chinese pulse chart, 17th century, this again from the Wellcome Library. And we have Kiriyama's wonderful book, The Expressiveness of the Body and the Divergence of Greek and Chinese Medicine. And Kiriyama writes, and again I will read this out loud, when early modern Europeans examined Chinese medical methods, they thought they saw practitioners feel the pulse. But Europeans who felt the pulse and Chinese who felt the mo were experiencing their bodies and their clients' bodies in highly differentiated ways. By the evidence of the eyes, Humo, that is palpating the mo, was unmistakably pulse diagnosis. But Chinese writings testified that the eyes were wrong. We must therefore ask how gestures can look the same yet differ entirely in experience. This alerts us to the limits of that European perspective. It shows us right off the bat that we need to be very careful in analyzing circumstances and trying to understand them in terms of their local traditions and cosmologies. Now we know that many early modern Europeans especially made a significant effort to understand Chinese and Eastern medicine. For the same reason, I would argue that we might imagine that Eastern doctors attempted to understand Western medicine. When something's working, you try to use it. Both sides of the globe, that seems to be a rule. So here we have, again, 14th century acupuncture diagram that came to the West and ended up in an archive in the West. Now, what the history of this particular document is, I cannot tell you, but we can probably easily imagine that it came to Europe following the tracks of people who went out across the world looking to find out what was on the other side of the planet. So we have, for example, Thomas Gerving, who was active in Russia and China, and it's likely that surgeons and doctors like Gerving kept long diaries, long correspondences, mailed packages, and told their contemporaries back home about all of the different things that they were encountering. The ways in which those encounters took place, though, are not simply transmitted to us through their letters, but they were probably also put into practice. So it's very likely that Western doctors in the East or in South America or North America began to just do things that they saw that worked in those areas. There was probably never any question about where the origins of these particular strategies came from, but when Europeans learned about these strategies, they saw them as European discoveries. Probably the same story could be told about Western medicine in the East. But that's a story, as far as I know, no one has attempted to look at. What we can say, taking a very general perspective, is that the 18th and 19th centuries became the era of European hegemony. In the 18th century, following upon 2 centuries of exploration, following upon 2 centuries of European gun, germs, and steel, nations in Europe had more capital, had more access to resources, and more knowledge than they had ever possessed. They began to form an identity, and originally in the 18th century, that nation-state identity in Europe took on a form of passive engagement in the outside world, in the world beyond the European shores. It took the form of alliances between principalities, and typically in the form of trade. This is not to say that Europeans were not especially violent, for example, in the North America continent, but it's probably more to admit that it was in the 19th century that some of the more pernicious practices that we associate with the era of European hegemony took place. That is, in the period after industrialization had brought and opened up enormous ability to produce in the European nations, and after the nation-state identities of those various countries had begun to form. We have various words that describe rather passively European engagement with the colonies. Words like mercantilism do not necessarily speak to us of an extractive policy, but it clearly was an extractive policy. And the colonies, whether they were the American colonies or whether they were colonies in China or Malacca or in Africa or South America, had to deal with policies that unfavorably worked against them. And at the same time, the European nations began to develop their own multinational treaties. These various nations began to engage together, began to work together, and medicine in the West emerged actually as a tool of empire in a very peculiar sense. If a competitor nation brought in goods that adversely impacted monopoly capital within another nation, one of the best ways to prevent it from actually entering the country was to declare the ship a plague ship. Quarantine policies sprang up across Europe in the 19th century, and they were obviously formed with very good reasons in mind, but they had this other element to them. They were used as the tools of empire. But more importantly, going back to that word mercantilism, these extractive opportunities, extractive policies, brought with them for Europeans a great sense of disquiet about the colonial project and colonial mission that they were engaged in. One need only think very briefly about Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness to see that there were views being expressed in some quarters among the moderns and the Victorians about the justifications for the colonial endeavor. Against these views, Western medicine was often used as a justification. Medicine became synonymous with progress. Yes, these extractive policies were in play, but medicine was given back to the savages. Medicine was given back to the backwards. Medicine in this way tells us that, medicine used this way tells us that the political history of medicine is extremely important. The global approach that I am arguing for today recognizes that. It accepts that and attempts to say something a little bit different. Some of the final thoughts then. This is a controversial perspective. It is not going to be a method of history telling that we are all going to wholeheartedly accept. And some people have, some scholars, for example, Dirklich and his colleagues, taken a very broad view of the importance of this approach and have cast it in the light of anti-imperialism, anti-capitalism, anti-everything, perhaps. But there is another side to this argument which I think is very important to recognize. It's the argument that there's nothing lost in recognizing that multiple indigenous knowledges were involved in the making of our knowledges, and that our knowledges are being made by other people who we don't know. Nothing is lost in that. If we think of the globe as working towards anything, then progress as a globally constructed phenomenon can only be a good thing. If we adopt this approach, then there may be some topics, and I'll just quickly delineate these, and then I will end. Obviously, the interaction of Tibetan and Chinese and Hippocratic medicine is going to be a topic that a lot of people will be interested in. And my own favorite topic that I would like to investigate, but have not had an opportunity yet, is why all of these Iberian apothecaries seem to have gone all over the globe in the 17th century, recording their experiences in places like Malacca. The story of smallpox inoculation is, of course, well known, but less well known are the diseases of animals. And here I think, just as a side note, we sometimes forget how alienated in the 21st century we are from the food chain. For 2,000 or 3,000 years before us, or however long you want human history to be, humans and animals have lived in very close proximity, and the diseases of animals may very well have helped humans understand their own diseases. And take, for example, the horse. We often underestimate how significant the horse was to our ancestors. But the horse was probably the strategic defensive commodity of the ages prior to the invention of the automobile. It was a weapon of war. It was a pack horse. It was an animal that could bring enormous power. And if it became sick, people's livelihoods were in jeopardy. So the history of animal diseases sits very neatly in this story. And it was those animals probably also that were a party to all of these experiences of trade and exchange that I've been talking about elsewhere in this lecture. The question of how indigenous practices became westernized is equally interesting. Topics that I am also particularly interested in is how yoga came to America. I don't know if anyone has written extensively on this topic, but it's worth noting that yoga is in fact a product of Eastern medicine. And then, from a perspective of our large international organizations, how was Western medicine, or medicine, as I'm constructing it today, standardized across the globe? How did diagnosis and how are therapies and pharmaceuticals being standardized today? What are the systems in place? What is the history of those organizations? How did the specialization of medicine take place? My research is on neurology, and it's amazing to me that there are neurologists everywhere on the planet. How did that happen? Where did they come from? How did peoples who had no experience of neurology come to accept it? And how did it conflict with their own traditions and cosmologies? We take something like karate, for example, and compare that to neurology, and we can see that there probably are interesting overlaps. And finally, the story of how we've dealt with new terrible experiences on the planet seems to me, HIV/AIDS being just one example, seems to me to be a story about the importance of this global perspective. It seems today we're looking at a world where increasingly anything that's local can be global, and so we probably need to not be parochial, because if it's there, it's probably going to be here, and instead of fearing it, we can probably work with it. What will we learn? Well, we're probably going to find out that multiple knowledge systems have created modern medicine. And like I've argued today, I don't think that's going to hurt us. I think we're also going to see that medicine remains universal, but that it probably is, in some sense, deeply local. Finally, we probably have to address the question of in what way globalization is going to affect our medicine. And here, I will just offer out a final thought, which is that probably in the 21st century and after, as we become more integrated communities, we're going to be pushing more and more responsibility down to the level of the individual to be informed. Local prejudice might blind us to reality. We don't want to go the direction of prejudice. We probably want to go, especially in matters of health, towards truth, because that's probably what will keep us alive. And with that, I'll just finish up by thanking a couple of people, and of course Clarkson University and the Wellcome Trust Center for the History of Medicine. Thank you very much.